Today we are going to explore one of the most fascinating secrets behind the rise of the greatest empire the ancient world has ever known. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this. In the vast plains of ancient Europe, under the grey sky of a winter morning, a column stretches as far as the eye can see. It is not just an army, it is a city in motion. 80,000 souls marching in perfect formation, the rhythmic sound of thousands of studded sandals echoing along the stone road. At the front, the bronze eagles of the legions catch the first rays of the sun. Behind, an endless serpent of wagons, pack animals, and people. This is the power of Rome in its purest form. But what keeps this machine in motion is not just the discipline or the courage of its soldiers. It is something much more fundamental, something that Roman generals understood better than any civilization of their time. Imagine for a moment the complexity of this spectacle. Each soldier carries approximately 30 kilograms of equipment: armor, weapons, entrenching tools, cooking utensils, personal provisions for several days. Multiply that by 20,000 legionaries, and you begin to understand the scale of the challenge. But that is only the beginning. There are also the auxiliaries, non-citizen troops recruited from all parts of the empire, bringing their own martial traditions, their own specialized equipment. Archers from Syria with their composite bows, heavy cavalry from Gaul with their long swords, slingers from the Balearic Islands with their simple but lethal weapons. The military philosopher Vegetius, centuries later, would summarize this principle in a single sentence that would echo through the ages. The main point in war is to secure ample provisions and to destroy the enemy by hunger. Simple words, but they carry a profound truth. Because in the campaigns that shaped the destiny of the known world, victory rarely depended solely on the clash of swords and shields. It depended on something much more subtle, much more complex. It depended on thousands of decisions made far from the battlefield, in silent offices in Rome, in warehouses on the shores of the Mediterranean, in farms scattered across Gaul and Hispania. Let us go back a few months before the march we witnessed. In the marble chambers of the Roman Senate, or perhaps in the imperial halls of the Palatine, a group of men gathers. They are senators, advisors, high-ranking officers. Before them, leather maps unrolled over dark wood tables. Their conversations are calculated, their decisions meticulous. A campaign is being planned. Not with the impetuosity of youth, but with the patience of those who built an empire through organization and planning. The decision to launch a military campaign is never taken lightly. There are motives to consider, resources to evaluate, consequences to weigh. Perhaps it is a rebellion on the borders that needs to be suppressed. Perhaps it is an opportunity for territorial expansion. Or perhaps it is simply the need to show strength, to remind neighboring peoples why Rome remains invincible. But regardless of the reason, the process that follows is always the same. It is a process that transformed the art of war. The scribes begin their calculations. 4 legions will be mobilized, each legion a unit of approximately 5,000 legionaries. Men trained since youth, veterans of previous campaigns, recruits eager to prove their worth. But these 20,000 legionaries are only the beginning. There will be auxiliaries, non-citizen soldiers recruited from all parts of the empire. There will be mercenaries, and then there will be the non-combatants, a category that includes everyone from engineers and doctors to artisans and servants. In total, this modest army will reach 80,000 people. Now comes the truly impressive part. These 80,000 need to move. From the lower Danube to the upper Rhine, a distance of 1,600 kilometers. Marching at a speed that would leave modern armies impressed, 150 kilometers per week, it would still take 2.5 months to cover this distance. 2.5 months during which each of these 80,000 people will need to eat, drink, sleep. During which 10,000 pack animals will need to be fed. During which 260 pieces of artillery will need to be transported, maintained, protected. The numbers begin to take on an almost frightening dimension. This is not just an army. It is literally the population of an entire ancient city in constant motion. And remember, we are talking about a moderate army. The Emperor Trajan, decades later, would gather 12 legions for his wars in Dacia. an army 3 times larger than this one. Imagine the magnitude of that undertaking. 60,000 legionaries, perhaps the same number again in auxiliaries, and a multitude of non-combatants that could easily double the total. 240,000 people crossing Europe. It is a migration on an epic scale, but a militarized migration organized, directed by a single purpose. But let us return to our army of 4 legions. The scribes know that the journey from the lower Danube to the upper Rhine will not be a straight line. There will be detours to avoid difficult terrain, stops for rest and reorganization, perhaps encounters with enemy forces that will require tactical maneuvers. So they calculate not only for the minimum distance, but for contingencies. They add a margin of safety to their numbers. Because running out of supplies in the middle of hostile territory is not just inconvenient, it is potentially catastrophic. The scribes continue their calculations, their pens scratching the papyrus. Each legionary needs at least 3,000 calories per day. 2/3 of that will come from bread, made from the wheat that will need to be transported, ground, baked. Water not just for drinking, but for cooking, for washing. 320,000 liters per day just for human and animal consumption. Wine, not as an indulgence, but as a necessity. Mixed with water, sometimes even with seawater for flavor. Wine serves a vital purpose. It disinfects the drinking water, making it safe for consumption. Think of the practical implications of this for a moment. In an era without modern water treatment, without chlorination, without advanced filtration, every water source is a potential Russian roulette. A seemingly crystal-clear stream could be contaminated miles upstream. A well might look pure but carry invisible diseases. The acidified wine kills many of the pathogens that would cause dysentery, typhoid fever, cholera. Diseases that could devastate an army as effectively as any enemy. And then there is the salt and the vinegar, essential preservatives in an era without refrigeration. Without them, food rots in days. With them, it can last weeks, perhaps months. Meat can be salted and hung to dry. Vegetables can be preserved in vinegar. Fish can be cured and stored for long journeys. Each of these supplies needs to be calculated, quantified, accounted for. The scribes work their abacuses, their fingers moving wooden beads rapidly, translating the abstract needs of an army into concrete numbers of bushels of wheat, amphorae of wine, bags of salt. But the soldiers do not live on bread and water alone. The animals that carry their loads, that pull their artillery, these also need to be fed. 2.5 kilos of barley or oats per day for each horse. 7 kilos of hay or straw, or, when possible, simply letting them graze on the lands they pass through. But this cannot always be guaranteed, so supplies of dry fodder need to be calculated, transported, stored. The mathematics of fodder is particularly challenging. Unlike soldiers who can tighten their belts and survive on reduced rations for some time, pack animals have more rigid needs. An undersupplied horse quickly loses condition, becomes incapable of pulling its load, eventually collapses and dies. And when that happens, all the load it was carrying must be redistributed among the remaining animals, overloading them in turn. It is a downward spiral that can paralyze an army. The Romans learned this through bitter experience in previous campaigns. There are records of armies forced to abandon heavy equipment, even valuable artillery, because they lost too many of their pack animals, so they are meticulous about this. Fodder for 3 months is calculated and stored. Routes are planned to pass through regions with good pastures. Scouts are sent ahead to identify suitable areas to graze the animals while the army camps. The numbers pile up. The lists grow. And then comes the most challenging question of all: how to transport all of this? How to ensure that when this army begins its march, when it leaves the safety of its bases and ventures into hostile territory, it will not run out of food without water, without the resources necessary to maintain itself as an effective fighting force. The Roman answer to this question is a system of impressive complexity. It begins with edicts sent to provinces scattered throughout the empire. These edicts are not requests. They are orders, calculated with mathematical precision, taking into account the demographics of each province, its tax revenues, its natural productions. Hispania, Sicily, Sardinia, known for their flocks of sheep, will receive orders to produce wool tunics and togas. Because a soldier who is cold is an ineffective soldier. The plains of Anatolia, granaries of the empire, will receive orders to produce grain in massive quantities. Each province has its role in this great orchestration, and each one knows that failure to fulfill its part will have severe consequences. There is an implicit hierarchy here, a system of responsibility that extends from the highest official in Rome to the smallest provincial administrator. Special officers are designated to compel the provinces to comply, sometimes by force if necessary. This is not a diplomatic suggestion. It is the law of the empire. But there are also opportunities for a province to demonstrate its loyalty, its value to Rome. There are records of provinces and allies competing with each other to provide supplies. Carthage and Numidia, in the 2nd century BC, sending grain, elephants, troops for distant wars of the Republic, each hoping to gain favor with Rome in their territorial disputes. It is a complex dance of power, loyalty, and ambition. Provinces that exceed their quotas may receive tax exemptions, commercial privileges, even elevation of status within the imperial hierarchy. Those that fail face not only punishment, but loss of prestige and opportunity. The months pass. On farms and villages across the empire, the work continues. Wheat being harvested, processed, stored. Wool being shorn, spun, woven. Wine being pressed, barrels being built. Everything converges on the large cities, especially those in the border provinces. Because there are 3 vital reasons to centralize these supplies within urban walls. First, it facilitates the presentation of supplies to the passing armies. Second, if the enemy launches preemptive attacks, they will find the countryside stripped of provisions, limiting both the damage they can cause and the loot they can collect. Third, if they decide to besiege any city, they will find it very well provisioned, capable of resisting until the main Roman army arrives to lift it. But even with all these supplies collected, stored, prepared, the question of transport still remains. And here the Romans again demonstrate their practical genius. They understand something fundamental. In the ancient world, the sea is the fastest road. A single Mediterranean ship can transport 150 tons, moving at a speed of 2 to 5 nautical miles per hour, depending on the wind. A single cargo could feed an entire legion for weeks. Compare that with land transport. A wagon pulled by oxen can carry perhaps half a ton, moving at perhaps 3 kilometers per hour on good roads. It would take 300 wagons to match the capacity of a single ship. And those 300 wagons would require 600 oxen, which in turn would need to be fed, further increasing the logistical load. The sea is not just faster, it is exponentially more efficient. The organization of these maritime transports likely involves private ship owners, merchants contracted by the Roman state. There are records of careful inventories being kept of the exact state of each ship, if any need repairs. Payments and tax exemptions likely serve as a reward for these risky journeys, because risky they are. The Mediterranean can be treacherous, storms appearing with little warning, pirates lurking in hidden coves. A lost ship means not only the loss of valuable cargo, but potentially an army left without critical supplies. But ships have their limitations. They are dependent on the season, the winds, the currents, so campaigns are frequently timed to follow the great rivers. The army marches along the Danube, the Rhine, the Rhone, and the supply ships sail alongside them, a synchronized dance of military force and logistical support. Trajan's column preserves these scenes for eternity, showing ships carrying barrels, tents, troops, even horses. For land supplies, there is the network of Roman roads, not built simply to facilitate travel, but specifically designed to move troops and supplies as quickly as possible. Without proper roads, an army on the march would leave only an irregular trail of mud and stones, slowing down wagons and baggage. Roads give the Romans speed, supplies are collected faster, distributed faster, and the army arrives faster, a decisive advantage over many of their enemies. Consider the engineering behind these roads. Carefully graded layers of stone, deep foundations that withstand time, drainage planned to avoid erosion, paved surfaces that remain passable even in heavy rain. Some of these roads still exist today, 2,000 years later, testaments to Roman engineering. The Via Appia, the Via Flaminia, the Via Egnatia. These were not mere paths. They were arteries of Roman power, allowing the legions to move quickly from one border to another for supplies to flow from the heart of the empire to its furthest limits. But no supply line can function efficiently without communication. The cursus publicus, the imperial post system, maintains a constant flow of information between the army, the rear, and Rome. Fresh horses and riders at every established distance, allowing messages to cross the empire at speeds that would not be surpassed until the modern era. Letters containing reports on the state of the campaign, recent activities of the army, future plans, short and long-term supply needs, additional orders. It is a system of constant feedback. The general in the field sends word of his needs. Civil administrators respond with information on what can be provided, when, how. Adjustments are made, routes are altered, priorities are rebalanced, all keeping the machine running smoothly. And now finally our army is in motion, that column we saw stretching across the European plains. But look closer. There is an order here, a carefully planned structure. The eagles of the legions march at the front. Behind them the main infantry. Then comes the baggage, protected by the best infantry behind and cavalry in front. Even the non-combatants and animals are divided into subunits, each with its own standard to follow, avoiding disorder and panic during sudden engagements. Visualize this from a high elevation, as if you were watching from a nearby hill. The column stretches for kilometers, a living line that snakes through the landscape. At the front, the cavalry scouts, moving quickly, always alert for signs of enemies. Then comes the vanguard, experienced legionaries ready to form battle lines at the first sign of danger. Then the eagles, the sacred standards of the legions, each guarded by a specially chosen standard-bearer, surrounded by an elite guard. To lose an eagle to the enemy would be an intolerable dishonor. Behind the eagles, the main body of the army. Row after row of legionaries, their rectangular shields swinging rhythmically as they march. Then comes the baggage, hundreds of wagons loaded with tents, tools, siege equipment, supplies. The pack animals, mules and oxen, moving in orderly rows. And finally the rear guard, more troops ready to turn and face any attack from behind. The camp followers, those civilians who follow the army seeking to profit from trade and plunder, march separately. It is impossible to coordinate such numbers, but the army does not abandon them completely. It marches ahead, but not so far as to leave them vulnerable to ambushes. It is a delicate balance. These civilians provide valuable services, selling goods that soldiers cannot obtain through official channels. But they are also a potential vulnerability, a disorganized crowd that could panic and create chaos if attacked. This constant movement is not accidental. It is essential, for several reasons. First, it keeps the men busy, always packing, always scouting, always digging. There is no time for idleness, and when an army is idle, it becomes prone to indiscipline, vulnerable to being caught by surprise, susceptible to thoughts of mutiny and desertion. Second, most locations simply cannot sustain an army for very long. Consider the daily needs: wood to keep warm, to cook, to build fortifications, water to drink and wash. These are resources that cannot be easily transported for an army, so every camp must be made near water and forests. But the magnitude of 80,000 people and 10,000 animals in one place quickly exhausts an area. The historian Josephus gives us a striking example. During the siege of Jerusalem, trees within a radius of 18 kilometers were cut down by the legions to build platforms, towers, siege machines. The very air around an army, Vegetius mentions, became visibly contaminated. The army's animals graze on the natural vegetation around. The dry fodder supplies are reserved for emergencies, but it does not take long for an army's animals to strip the land of any grass, necessitating even more constant movement. And the water source, our 320,000 liters per day, would not last long near a Roman army. So the army moves, always moves, and as it moves it leaves behind a network of fortresses and garrisons. These are vital. They are the arteries through which supplies flow. If they fall, the supply line falls, and then the entire army falls. A wise general carefully selects who garrisons these positions. Not the best soldiers, those are needed on the front line, but those who are less fit for active service, the wounded, recovering but not ready for battle, the less experienced, who can gain experience in a safer position. and curiously the most rebellious and problematic. This last category is particularly clever. Soldiers who could corrupt the morale of the main army with thoughts of mutiny are removed, but in a way that makes them feel valued. An astute general can even make guard duty sound like a promotion. We entrust you with this highly important task of guarding our rear and managing the flow of supplies. It is hard for a soldier to remain frustrated when his superior officers express such confidence. This new sense of purpose tends to neutralize them as a threat. And then the army penetrates enemy territory. Here, theoretically, it could transfer the problem of obtaining supplies to the enemy itself, foraging from the fields it crosses, and this happens. Trajan's column shows legionaries gathering grain in open fields, but it is probably the exception, not the norm, because there are good reasons not to depend too much on foraging. Grain provided is already harvested and processed, saving valuable time. If the goal of the campaign is to acquire territory after punishing the enemy, then preserving their agriculture facilitates the transition to Roman rule. More importantly, Rome will not later need to provide them with money and food to prevent famine or revolts until the next harvest. To achieve this, the Romans instill heavy discipline. The army must act for the benefit of the state, not for immediate personal enrichment. And Roman armies strive to be as self-sufficient as possible, accounting for logistical disruptions or unexpected campaigns. Archaeology has revealed dozens of clerical and specialized positions in the legions. Doctors to treat the wounded, veterinarians to care for animals, hunters to supplement food supplies, shepherds to manage flocks, boatmen to operate river vessels, mule drivers to manage pack animals, and many more. Each legionary is a small gear in the great logistical machine of the Roman army. Together, they can maintain their own clothes, armor, animals, equipment, weapons, artillery pieces. A Roman helmet found in Valkenburg had been passed through 5 different soldiers over the years. The same was true for armor and other equipment, often recycled or repaired to be issued to new recruits. A Roman army can create its own projectiles, siege engines, practically any form of construction. This self-sufficiency is a tremendous strategic advantage. It reduces dependence on vulnerable supply lines. It allows for continuous campaigning even when supply chains are interrupted. Even the distribution of food within the army has its own system. Some positions and ranks receive different proportions and quality of rations, depending on their level of prestige or punishment. Roman citizen legionaries receive more rations than non-citizen auxiliaries. Punished legionaries receive not only fewer rations, but cheaper food, barley, instead of wheat. But such distributions must be made carefully so as not to increase tensions among the men. And in difficult times during sieges or when supplies dwindle, this system is abandoned. Every man receives the same rations, regardless of rank or punishment, because ultimately, the survival of the army depends on its cohesion. There are still the camp followers to consider. Their numbers vary depending on how rich Rome's enemies are thought to be. The historian Livy describes an interesting campaign in Liguria where there were almost no camp followers because the region was poor and offered little plunder. These civilians seek profit through looting and trade. They are a double-edged sword. They can provide valuable services, selling goods that soldiers desire. But they are also additional mouths to feed, additional complications to manage. And through all of this, through every decision, every calculation, every movement, there is a guiding principle. The principle that Vegetius would articulate centuries later. The main point in war is to secure ample provisions and to destroy the enemy by hunger. Because the Romans understood something profound about the nature of war. That the most complete victory, the most decisive, is the one achieved without shedding blood. If you can maneuver your enemy into a position where he simply can no longer fight, where his supplies are gone, where his troops are starving and demoralized, then you have won. And you have won in a way that preserves your own fighting power for the next campaign, and the next. This is the genius of Roman military logistics. It is not just about moving supplies from point A to point B. It is about turning supplies into a strategic weapon. It is about building a system so robust, so resilient, that your army can operate indefinitely in hostile territory. It is about creating a war machine that is self-sustaining, self-repairing, practically unstoppable. And it works. For centuries it works. From a small city-state in central Italy, Rome expands to dominate the entire Mediterranean, pushing deep into Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, and at every step of this epic journey, it is logistics that makes it possible. It is the scribes making their calculations. It is the provincial administrators organizing supplies. It is the merchants sailing dangerous seas. It is the engineers building roads that will last millennia. It is the common soldiers, each doing their small part, maintaining their armor, caring for their mule, guarding their stretch of road. Together they create something greater than the sum of its parts. They create a logistical machine that allows Rome to project power at distances that would be impossible for any other ancient civilization. They create the system that sustains the legions, and the legions create the empire. This is the true foundation of Roman power. Not just the courage of its soldiers, not just the skill of its generals, but the meticulous, tireless, brilliant organization of its logistical systems. It is a lesson that would echo through the centuries, studied by generals from Napoleon to Eisenhower. Because in the end, in every war, in every conflict, there is a fundamental truth. Armies march on their stomachs, and the Romans ensured that their stomachs were always full. If this journey through the heart of Roman power captured your imagination, if you find yourself seeing ancient history in a new light, then join us in this ongoing exploration. Every subscription allows us to dive deeper into the systems that shaped civilizations. Every like tells us we are on the right path. And your comments show us which stories resonate most strongly. Because just as the Romans built their empire, one stone, one road, one supply at a time, we build this channel together, one narrative at a time, until the next journey through time.